promote, and fulfill freedom of thought, particularly given that many governments use social media themselves to convey their own communications. And across the world, there are varying levels of dependency upon social media for news, for information, for businesses, and so on. So, what are the measures that we can use to assess the extent to which freedom of thought is protected, promoted, and fulfilled in the context of social media? And these are some of the questions and issues that our three speakers today will address. We will go in the order of Richard, Nina, and Christoph. Each speaker will have up to 15 minutes, and then we'll hand over to our very own Kelly for discussion before opening up to Q&A. By way of brief introduction, Dr. Richard Mackenzie Gray Scott is an Associate Fellow of the Bonavera Institute of Human Rights at the University of Oxford and works currently with the Centre for International Governance and Innovation and the Open Rights Group, as well as doing teaching at the University of Pennsylvania. Richard, you're very welcome. Thank you very much for joining us, and I'll leave it to you to begin.
Great, cheers. You can hear me all right, aye? Yeah, great. Cheers for inviting me along and for organising this, and to everyone else for coming along as well. And basically, I've been asked to chat for about 15 odd minutes about some of my research in this area. And I basically want to try and do three things. First, to try and explain what I think freedom of thought means, and then briefly lay out why I think false content on social media poses a risk to this right. Second, I really want to emphasize that I don't think that all social media is inherently problematic or harmful. I think it's specific platforms that, when you assess them against human rights criteria, raise concerns. And then third, I just want to chat a wee bit about how we can maybe operationalize freedom of thought on social media, specifically by aligning sort of platform architecture and data usage with privacy and the right to rest. And also because, as Beth said, this is a forum for discussion, I thought I'd end with a wee sort of provocation, considering there's a lot of people interested in freedom of thought here. So to take the first point about freedom of thought and the risk of false content, so a bit of my work is sort of focused on the technical interventions that you could use to help manage human rights related issues on social media. However, these approaches have inherent limitations because the underlying business model remains unchanged. And that business model is essentially one where platforms aim to gather as much data about users on platform for as long as possible. Some people call this engagement, but especially in the context of mental autonomy and freedom of thought, I think of it as more as being encaged, in that your mind is essentially placed in a bird cage for however long you happen to be on a particular platform. So maybe afterwards as well, because that's something that I think about quite a bit, is that the information you interact with online can keep you sort of preoccupied mentally, even when you're offline. Now, in terms of what I think freedom of thought is, I do think the core of this right rests somewhere about in the area of like empowering individuals to sort of shape and form their own thoughts and their thinking. It's not just about being able to keep your thoughts to yourself. It's about being the principal author of those thoughts, having the ability to hold sort of like multiple ideas at once, exercising your imagination, and also, I think, crucially, changing your mind when necessary, and that there's going to be compelling reasons for doing so. And I think when someone's thinking becomes constrained by sort of what I would call negative misbelief, which can be shaped, I think, in part by false content on social media, I think we begin to see what I would call regressive thought, which I think brings a risk of impairing freedom of thought. And regressive thought for me essentially refers to this sort of mental process where an individual basically clings to a false belief, influenced by exposure to either misleading or false content on social media. And I think it hampers the individual's ability to think freely and critically as they become sort of locked into this narrow way of thinking that discourages sort of mental flexibility and hampers the ability to be responsive to new information instead of merely reacting to things instantaneously. And I think this harm or potential harm of regressive thought arises when thinking is bound to a misbelief, or a person basically becomes mentally tethered to positions associated with it. And I think part of mental activity can get warped, and negative misbelief transforming into regressive thought, I think, closes the mind off to existing and potential avenues of thought, including those that are capable of considering alternative ideas, narratives, perspectives, particularly those that do not align with the substance that's contained in false information that supports a particular misbelief. And I think this internal harm is basically intensified should regressive thought disrupt freedom of the will, because then I sort of see it in an old philosopher, Harry Frankfurt's terms, is that people risk becoming a helpless bystander to the information that influences them and their behavior. Now, well, I think some platforms can contribute to this risk. Not all social media platforms are the same, which sort of brings me on to my second point. And it's really important, I think, not to group all of social media platforms together and label them as problematic or harmful from the perspective of human rights. And I think this because they're not all going to be designed in ways that are detrimental to human rights, that risk, freedom of thought or freedom of expression. Some are problematic, obviously. I think you mentioned Meta at the start. That'd be one company that I'd use as an example. Their social media platforms are problematic, but I think others are considerably less so. And something that I like to try and put out there, including in classes as well, when people talk about social media, everybody talks about these brand names and they stick in our discourse for a reason: YouTube, Instagram, yada, yada, yada. But there's many others that are not problematic. Because the data that they take, if any, on users, it doesn't exploit the users. And I think that's an important distinction to make. But I think there are two main risks on social media usage that are posed to freedom of thought. And I think the first one's actually about how our societies are structured, in the sense that we are kept overwhelmingly busy. And I think we're left with very little room to self-direct our attention and thought. I think we spend a lot of the time, the majority of the day, reacting in response to external causes. And I think when you combine this with the second problem, which is the digital design and data usage choices made by platforms, things like infinite scroll, autoplay, numbering notifications and reactions, and then also things like forced binaries, which don't need to be binaries. For example, like I agree to this privacy policy, or I'm going to read this confusing legal document that I don't understand. And I think users are essentially pushed into certain behaviors that can limit their mental autonomy, while encouraging them to stay on what is essentially autopilot, where they passively consume information instead of actively engage with it. And these choices about platform governance are not fixed, they can be changed. But one of the key questions I ask is what should be driving that change? And this sort of brings me to my third point about how to align social media governance and usage with human rights considerations, particularly when considering freedom of thought. And especially because a currently accepted element of this right concerns states fostering an enabling environment for freedom of thought to flourish. And I think in this context of social media, the key drivers of change actually lie in things like privacy and rest, two human rights that, in my view at least, are strongly connected to freedom of thought. I think if platforms actually respected users' privacy, then users wouldn't have to essentially self-manage their own rights when they're online, and their data could be used in ways that empower people instead of exploiting their minds. And instead, what happens at the moment is, at least in the predominant platforms implement, things that undermine a lot of key core principles of data protection. But instead, if you enable those, like, for example, purpose limitation, data minimization, those things that I think hold a lot of promise. And I think if platforms held less data on users, or more extremely, if the data economy simply didn't exist as a marketplace, I honestly think many of the issues we face with respect to mental autonomy, freedom of thought, they might not be so pronounced, at least when I limit that to thinking about false content and the potential for harm that it can cause. And similarly, when I think about the right to rest, I think if people had more opportunities to be less busy and sort of disconnect, not just from online things, but more frequently, especially from social media, where individuals are basically free from this sort of mental birdcage that I think keeps people reacting and responding to things that are going on external to themselves. I think there'd be a bit more like time and space for critical thinking, self-reflection, and sort of resisting the negative effects of social media on our minds. So again, people who sort of self-direct their attention, their preferences, thoughts, and their behavior. And this sort of brings me back to the point about designing social media for user empowerment as opposed to exploitation. And I think that's a conversation that, in my view, needs to grow, in particular those that actually build and alter and push for alterations of social media platforms. And I think at the moment, big platforms are basically designed to exploit, and platforms, they prioritize mission, keeping them locked in a cycle of what I would say is just constant bombardment of information. And I think this exploitation is compounded by, like I said earlier, the societal busyness that we have, which reduces, I think, what I'd sort of describe as maybe free-flowing thinking. And I think challenging this is important because I do think social media could sort of be imagined as a tool for empowerment and mental autonomy. And I think, especially if user rights were respected and their well-being with respect to their mental integrity was taken into consideration, I think platforms might not even be in a position where they'd actually be respecting freedom of thought, but they actually might help protect the right as well. And I did mention that I wanted to end with a little provocation, so I will. And it's basically, I'm not sure how, maybe not the right word is important, but like how significant it is at this point to try and pin down the legal definition of freedom of thought. I think, and I'm going to
Richard,
unpack that a little bit, even if more case law matters going to settle in soon, and I don't sure. Yeah.
sorry, you're freezing for me, and according to chat other people.
Oh, sorry.
Can you please, for this last bit, we're all desperately wanting to hear your provocation. Would you mind turning your camera off? And
Yeah,
because
sure.
that sometimes helps, and begin again from your provocation, please.
Yeah, sure. Sorry if you lost me there. Basically, I think it's not that big a deal if we don't settle what the legal definition of freedom of thought is now. Because even though there are issues with laws that are considered vague, I'm not sure what the issue is when it's a human rights law that's vague, because with that vagueness, I think comes flexibility to harness different approaches to protecting a particular right through law and policy. And international law, especially, sometimes gets critiqued for being quote unquote too vague. And I don't think this vagueness is necessarily a problem when it benefits those that are the weaker party, when you're referring to a particular power asymmetry, where it's between an individual and a company or between a state and an individual. And I think first because vague international law is doing precisely what it should be, which is setting a minimum benchmark for domestic law and policy actors to work with so that they can internalize and implement related rules in ways that best serve the populations of each respective state. And there is flexibility inherent in vagueness, which, if it's in laws that seek to protect weaker parties, I think can be good. Now, obviously, if it's flexibility in laws that provide rights to more powerful parties, then I think that's a different matter because you can open rules up to abuse including to extents where any loads of exceptions become part of the rule, and the core content of that rule can get eroded even to the extent where it's ignored. So basically, I think if you get too specific in honing in what the legal edges of a rule are, you make it easier to circumvent that rule. It's a problem known as over precision, and it's something that's a principal concern for those that draft legislation, because you can end up making rules under inclusive. And with human rights, I think we'd all agree that you want rules that are more inclusive because they offer more protection to a wider set of situations. You essentially maximize potential protection instead of minimize it. You get too precise with the legal edges of the rule, and all of a sudden you're failing to capture conduct that could result in the same types of harm that your over precise rule should be capturing, but can because you defined it too much. And just because Beth brought it up, while the lawsuits against social media companies regarding, mental well-being are being like debated right now in dockets and whatnot, I'm not sure human rights law is the best approach when confined to the matter of litigation, not only because it's other areas of law that the litigation is going to be grounded in, like Beth noted, but also because litigation can be very drawn out, is highly costly to the individuals involved, not so much the companies. It might not lead to lasting change, especially when suits get settled and we don't know what the terms of those settlements were. And I think just generally too much emphasis and also pressure, in my opinion, is placed on judiciaries to sort of magically solve risks that are posed to human rights, where I think effectively addressing those rights, at least in this case, lies in other things like platform design and data governance practice, enforcing laws that we actually have already, and particularly in a way where legislation ensures that the design and platform governance sits within sort of democratically agreed upon parameters. And states do have a positive obligation to protect freedom of thought. And I think at least part of this obligation entails changing how platforms operate, ensuring they respect users' rights, particularly their privacy, and empowering individuals rather than exploiting them when they do sign up to platforms, where their data is essentially being used to their benefit instead of against them. And I think the main thing there is that with that data, there's a lot more opportunities to either, like I said, enable freedom of thought or undermine it. And I think I'll just sort of wrap that up there and cheers. And sorry if you lost me before.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. Turning your video off worked a charm. We got every word. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Um, that was a really great overview, and it was very helpful to hear your particular perspective. I'm struck that you have quite a narrow view of the right to freedom of thought, in that you seem to really hinge it on rational thought, the capacity for rational thought, but then your idea of regressive thought is actually quite broad and could be actually quite difficult for the law or a regulator or whatever to quantify or assess. And I was also struck that you didn't talk about specifically mention addiction, even though you did seem to infer addiction with busyness. And then your final provocation, I do have some thoughts on that. But I don't want to take up any more time. And perhaps it'll be something that we can have discussion on. So for now, I will thank you once again and invite Nina to present. Nina, I don't know if you have slides. Do you have
I
slides?
I actually do, but I'm sorry also if you see me on a tiny screen. I'm having issues with my with my laptop, so I'm on my phone.
Okay,
Um,
so what I'll introduce you, and as I do that, maybe Kelly can make you co-host, and then you'll be able to display your slides.
Perfect.
Nina Keese is former researcher of the British Academy Global Professorship on Human Rights Law in the Digital Age that happened University of Oxford. Currently, she's working as a legal consultant for the Turkey Human Rights Litigation Support Project, which is based at Middlesex University. Nina, thank you very, very much, and please feel free to begin when you are ready.
I just saw that Kelly sent me a message to, I might quickly send her the slide, if that's okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question, Andre, in the group. Hold it, because we will hopefully have at least 30 minutes for discussion after everyone's presented. Christoph, do you have slides as well? No. Okay, great.
Beth, I think I might just go ahead without the slides because in keeping with Christoph and Richard, and I think given the time, it might be just more straightforward to do it like that, if that's okay with everyone.
If you're comfortable with that, there's nothing wrong with having a crutch.
I think it might be best.
Okay.
And yeah, I just wanted to say thanks so much for organizing again, and Kelly, thanks so much for accepting to be discussant. I think it was a great introduction by Richard because he touched on so many of the really key points that have to do with social media and freedom of thought, and a lot of the kind of big topics that are being discussed at the moment. And there's going to be, I think, some overlap in our views, especially on the focus that he brought in relation to autonomy and how there's nothing inevitable about the current design and operation of social media platforms, and that through better regulation, there are ways to protect autonomy and empower users. I think where I'm going to diverge a little bit is I'm going to zoom in a little bit on the idea of online influence as a process, targeting users, and I'm going to look at how that affects the process of thinking. So rather than looking at particular thoughts or the content of the thoughts that are affected, I'm going to focus on thinking as a process. So when I talk about online influence, I mean, it's very broad, but it does cover a massive range of practices that a lot of us have researched, and that encompass, for example, things from electoral disinformation, political disinformation, to the cases that have been on the headlines about addictive design of platforms and so on. We, as some of you might be aware, myself and Mark Leiser co-authored the chapter in the book that Beth and Patrick edited on freedom of thought, where we sort of tried to set out a framework or a threshold for determining when some of these influences might violate freedom of thought. And I won't go over it again, but the thing I wanted to zoom into today is the concept of mental autonomy and what it could mean more concretely for helping us determine the threshold of severity for something to violate freedom of thought, for a manipulative practice or an influence to violate freedom of thought. And I think, the idea of autonomy sounds quite vague, and, there's multiple legal and philosophical definitions out there, but one that I find particularly persuasive is one that's been provided by Shona Shifrin, who's a philosopher, and she talks about the free development and operation of the mind. And I think that her and others' notion of autonomy in that sense is quite interesting because it departs a little bit from an understanding of autonomy that's maybe rooted a bit in the Enlightenment and maybe other philosophical traditions, where it's more about sort of the having an impermeable mind. And her idea is more of autonomy as something that's relational and that can be enriched by external influences, but that should also be protected against undue influences. And the whole difficulty, of course, is to define what is an undue influence in relation to that. And I know that a lot of others as well have set out a few factors that have to do with, what constitutes manipulation and what constitutes impermissible manipulation. And these include things like the hiddenness of an influence or a vulnerability of the targeted groups or persons, and so on. And I think a thing that we tried to develop in the chapter was also bringing in a kind of substantive element of, yes, there may be influences that are hidden and that target persons who are particularly vulnerable and so on. But what makes them violate freedom of thought? And there, I think it's very useful to look at connected rights and to have a kind of evolutionary approach to freedom of thought. And so to try to narrow it down to cases in which autonomy is affected in a sufficiently global way as opposed to local. So that means that it's not so much kind of a transient interference on autonomy, but more a kind of network of influences or looking at a whole of influences that affects our inner self in a sufficiently global way. And of course, the whole challenge is to identify cases where that does happen. But I think that we can look at case law on freedom of religion or case law on privacy to guide us in that respect. I think that the idea of this idea of autonomy and kind of global autonomy is also quite interesting when we're thinking about the collective dimension of freedom of thought. So I know that a few others have written about this as well, but there's a lot to explore in relation to what that means for democracy and self-governing societies. And I'm just checking the time. But I think that there's a lot to explore there in terms of what is the relationship between the free development and operation of the mind and democratic society as we understand it. And I just want to say also a few things quickly about what this kind of framework means in terms of the positive obligations of states. I think, I wholeheartedly agree with Richard on the idea that, human rights frameworks are quite vague by nature, and that's not a bad thing because, there's space for different interpretations and for things to evolve and move. But I think that there's still a lot of value in that vague human rights framework that is framed around autonomy in kind of understanding what states' positive obligations look like to prevent manipulative practices that violate freedom of thought, to protect people against them, and to fulfill their human rights obligations. So I think that when we take an approach to manipulation and freedom of thought that's grounded in both protection of autonomy and looking at contextual factors that affect freedom of thought, like as I mentioned, hidden influences and vulnerability, we can begin to see what positive obligations might entail. So one that's been a subject of a lot of attention is transparency-related obligations, and we see that there's increasing amounts of regulation around that, questions of kind of labeling inauthentic content or content that is AI generated, for example. And so that relates to freedom of thought as well. But other obligations might also involve measures, a regulatory framework imposing obligations on social media platforms in terms of addressing specific vulnerabilities of categories of people, for example, children, and more broadly and beyond these specific obligations, I think Christoph is going to touch on that in a maybe more expanded way, but there would also be what people have referred to as enabling environment obligations. And these would be much broader obligations in relation to conditions of online conditions or conditions on social media platforms that allow manipulative practices or violations of freedom of thought to occur. And it would be about addressing potentially concentrations of power that leads to these power asymmetries that I've mentioned, monopolies, and so much more structural conditions that enable freedom of thought. And interestingly, this idea of an enabling environment, which is also which exists in relation to freedom of expression, in the case law on freedom of expression, it was mentioned in a recent recommendation by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe in relation to kind of digital risks, digital safety. And in that recommendation, which is from 8th of April, so very recent, the Committee of Ministers expands a little bit on this idea of enabling environment obligations and what those entail in terms of accountability, ensuring accountability of platforms for exposing individuals to harm in terms of oversight and other specific obligations. So that's also, there seems to be increasing traction for this kind of broader set of obligations that would also require, human rights impact assessments by companies. I'll stop there and I'll hand it over to Christoph.
Thank you, Nina. That was really excellent, and thank you so much for adjusting your presentation to deliver it without slides. Thank you very much. And it was your chapter is a very ambitious chapter, and I don't mean that in a kind of veiled way. I mean that it is really, really an important contribution, and actually I think it's probably one of the most read chapters, and the chapter that has probably been taken up the most in the book. I haven't checked the statistics, but that is my feeling. It's been cited in various different reports, so it has been very influential in terms of trying to understand not only what are the harms for individual autonomy, but also collective, but also how do we establish systems in order to preserve this particular conception of autonomy that hinges directly on notions and concepts that underlie freedom of thought. And I won't, ask what the distinction between manipulation and persuasion is, which is a perennial question around freedom of thought. But occurred to me that actually it might be helpful for us to look at the distinction courts have made in the sphere of freedom of religion and belief between the distinction between preaching and proselytizing. Okay, Christoph, you are next. Thank you again to Nina and welcoming Christoph Bublitz, who is a co-convener of this network and is a legal scholar who's worked on this topic for many years, based at the University of Hamburg. Christoph, take it away.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Richard, and thank you, Nina, and hello, everyone. Nice to see you. Great that you are here. I just want to say a few things, and I think it fits quite nicely with what we just heard, and perhaps it's also a little bit of provocation at the end. I'm thinking about this, Richard, just to counter this a little bit. So what do I want to talk about? So I think at the moment when we hear about freedom of thought in the context of social media and everything closely around it, platform regulations, these kind of things, I think there is a problem. And the problem is that it's not clear how freedom of thought really applies to this in the legal sense. And now we get many perspectives from ethics and philosophy, from law, and then from within the law, we would have to see what jurisdiction, what concept of freedom of thought are we talking about. And I think these things at the moment get a little bit blurred together and are not often made quite explicit. And I think this leads to typical problems of translation between disciplines, between legal systems. And I don't think that's particularly helpful, even though it's not uncommon. And I want to ask in the end, perhaps, if there are strategies to get out of this, perhaps conceptual strategies or other strategies, because otherwise I think there's a danger of all the people working from different perspectives rather blocking themselves than contributing to what they really want to contribute, which is a meaningful contribution to the regulation of digital technologies, I would guess. Okay, that's roughly my point. Let me very quickly make it in several steps. So freedom of thought as a legal right, international human right, is probably an absolute right. I know George is here, but he would probably agree it is at least the mainstream. That's how it is seen. We can argue whether it should be like this, but let's keep with this idea for the moment. If this is an absolute right, it has to be a narrowly construed right. That's also quite clear from the legal perspective. And even in the drafting documents, I was explicitly mentioning it cannot apply to rhetoric and persuasion. It needs to be preserved for severe kind of interferences. So if that's the case in international human rights law, and this is where the right has seen some renewed interest, I would think. But that's not even the case for domestic laws. So Canada Constitution has it, for instance. They don't have absolute rights. I see Mark Blitz here in the chat. He's writing about the American system that they don't even have a right to freedom of thought, but perhaps an implicit right. So these rights already may have different features, and this may result in different interpretations. But let's stick to the international right here for a second. If this is an international human right, then to me, the case has not yet been made why precisely social media really interferes with it. So we send messages, we send repeated messages. That's all good, but it doesn't seem so different from traditional times of advertisement. Perhaps it's more augmented, it might be more personalized, but the basic way of interfering or engaging with the mind of another person still is sending a message, a picture, a video, whatever, even if it's sophisticated way. So to me, all of this would usually not qualify as an interference with freedom of thought. And then, of course, we can argue, yeah, but perhaps there's more to it. And Nina was just giving us certain conditions, which we all should take into consideration. But I would think, even then, it's at least arguable why this interferes with the right. And it will be rejected by many people from the legal sphere, especially when they are not that familiar with freedom of thought and perhaps have some resistance towards accepting that right in this sense anyway. So I think perhaps we can look, where does it begin? So I think perhaps if you remember Clockwork Orange, in earlier talks, I used to take this a lot, but then I forgot it a little bit. But then I saw the picture in Shor's talk the other day. So there is this famous technique where they strap that criminal to that chair and then they bombard him with all kind of media stimuli for a long time, the Ludovico technique or something. And let's suppose this works. I would think, okay, here we can start to talk about freedom of thought interference perhaps, but social media use might be more minor. And I think more generally, it's probably the case that all of these digital technology problems will have the characteristic that individually the effects may only be minor and subtle. And when we always point to the big effects, we may kind of like not be taken serious. You can also see this with, is social media really making an addiction? Do we really use addiction in the same normative sense like fentanyl? I'm not sure. There are similarities, but there's dissimilarities. So the whole debate about social media seems to be that some people hype the problems a lot, whereas of course the companies downplay them. So I think it's probably not such a good strategy in general if you have to ride the train on hyping the problems up all the time. So having said all of this, even though I don't want to speak against Nina, but I think we would need, let's say, aggravating circumstances to say there's really an intervention, and I would say probably most of the time this is not the case. And then all these arguments about social media violating freedom of thought can very easily be rejected by whoever is addressed by them. So companies can say, look, this is not really freedom of thought violation. Politicians can say that, look, this is not this, and courts can say we're not hearing that case. So this doesn't really help. Even though freedom of thought might appear as an attractive notion, it might not help, at least when it refers to the international case. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, I also think it doesn't help freedom of thought development if we now start to develop it with a use case where it's then just not applicable. So I think there's some danger in invoking it very loosely, let's say. Even though in my heart, there's this German saying of two hearts beating in my chest. Of course, I would love to be freedom of thought to see it applied in practice. Eventually, I would love to. I'm just not convinced that these kind of cases are the ones that will be so persuasive. Okay, having said this, I think there is a deeper problem, that is the lacking legal protection of the mind more broadly. And that is a little bit a different debate to the freedom of thought debate. There are these rights, mental integrity, and so on, which I think should apply, but they would need to be applied and operationalized a little bit more in order to make a convincing case. And I think that might be the more worthwhile kind of way to do, especially if one also agrees that many of these digital technologies will have these minor effects. Even if some make the threshold wherever it is, most of them probably will not. And there would be an argument for mental integrity. Okay, so I think this is perhaps the more successful strategy. However, and now we come to the positive obligation. This is based on a paper, I can put it in the chat. I think there's still some reason to say, but some of the things that freedom of thought seems to point to are exactly the kind of problem that these digital technologies actually create. And I would think, yes, that's the case. It's just the intensity might not be the same. But if you want to use freedom of thought, I think going the route that Nina has just indicated, the positive obligation route, is probably the most convincing one. And then in this dimension, this unclear dimension of fulfillment, states have an obligation to fulfill the full enjoyment of the right. So these are weak obligations, much weaker than this negative obligation of freedom of thought, but at least there's some obligation. And we can say then things like states are obliged to promote freedom of thought, and then we can perhaps operationalize it a bit more and say this means, for instance, the right to attention or creative thinking, these kind of psychological capacities. And we can say states are obliged to promote this. And here's this digital environment which seems to be harmful, therefore states should do something. But this is a very weak claim. It's much weaker than saying whatever platform X interferes with these kind of thoughts. So yeah, and this, I think, leaves us in a strange situation. I think we cannot usually say platform X or whatever violates freedom of thought. I think unless heightened circumstances, this doesn't work. We can say states are obliged to do something against this in a weak sense, but this already is a conceptual distinction that will only make sense for lawyers, which is not very attractive from the policy side. And now the question is with the ethics people. Now, people from ethics can say, look, we don't care about, rightfully say, we don't care about your absolute, these kind of debates. We just talk about the ethics of digital technologies, and they interfere with freedom of thought. And yes, it's true, you can make that case, but this will lead to let's say, a separation of the legal and the ethical concept, and then they will not be able to speak to one another again. And especially in this fast-moving field where ethics and law kind of like work together very closely, I think this is perhaps an unfortunate result. So it would also be unfortunate, however, if the legal people keep on speaking about their absolute right and the ethics people keep on speaking about a broader right, and then they just speak about this without making clear that they are speaking about different things. This will just lead to lost in translation. This will not be helpful for any side. So the question is then, how can we, and this would be the question for the community, how can we avoid this? And one idea would be to say, let's speak about a different term. So why don't we speak about cognitive liberty, for instance? This is not a legal term, even though some try to make it into a legal term. And it's much more vague, and we can just use it in the sense that freedom of thought, you've all heard of it, it was supposed to be the update of freedom of thought for the present day. That could be a strategy to do so. Of course, in the legal context, you will not win with cognitive liberty. No judge finds this in the books. But if we don't want to talk about really law in the hard sense, we want to talk about the ethics and the more general ideas. We can even say about the human rights principles, for instance, this kind of looser language. Why not using that term? Now, I think there's one argument against using that term, and that is freedom of thought is such much more established and just has this higher authority to it. But if this higher authority comes from its legal standing as an international human right, I think then we are in a circle argument. Then we have to work with the specific legal understanding. If we don't want to work with that, then perhaps we cannot appeal to the authority of that thing as a human right. And if one wants to say, but we want to appeal to it more as a general history of ideas concept, then I would think this gets so vague that I don't think that this is really the authority one can appeal to. At least it seems to me that if that's the argument why we should use that concept, then we can also use another concept, because it's not really established. So what the ethical debate would need to be doing at the moment is also to establish that the old political French Revolution concept of freedom of thought actually applies to digital technology. So that battle is the same for the human rights scholars and for the ethics scholars. It's not established in any of these fields, so I don't really see why that should be the decisive argument. So this would be then, Richard, I think this is somehow in agreement with what you are saying. It's just from the other way around. I would be saying, why don't we all stop talking about freedom of thought? If we want to use it in this loose way, let's use cognitive liberty instead, and then we have all the freedoms to put in whatever we want to put in. And if we want to make precise legal arguments, we get back to freedom of thought, but then we will probably have the point that most of these social media things will not fall under it. Okay, that's my input. Let's discuss. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christoph. Kelly, I'm going to turn straight to you. If you take 10 minutes, and then we'll open for Q&A.
Right. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, but still with an echo.
Okay, any better?
No.
I think you are still in the call with several identities, which is a nice way in this postmodern world, but perhaps you can get rid of one for a moment.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Yeah, I removed two of my other avatars. I don't know how they showed up there, but okay. Right, okay. Thanks a lot for the presentations. And I found it to be extremely interesting that there are points of agreements and several points of disagreements. And I want to kind of focus on both. And I don't want to take up all 10 minutes. I'll kind of rush through everything that I had to say. Right. So the points of agreement, everyone agrees that social media is a huge problem. Something needs to be done about it. The recent global running after all these big tech is definitely indicative of the fact that there is a problem there. And freedom of thought, the right to freedom of thought, has some potential. So much of agreement. Disagreement I see, especially in the discussion today, on 2 points. One is the role of personal autonomy and the role of law, which is a welcome surprise in the sense that it was good to talk about the fact that is it even the same right we're talking about, or should the law come into the picture at all? Right. So I want to kind of turn to each of the speakers on their presentations and then try to have my couple of 2 cents to add on the points of disagreement, really. So Richard, I found it to be extremely interesting that you focus so much on personal autonomy in a narrow sense. And reading your paper, especially the one about nudges, what occurred to me is that you seem to have more of an instrumentalist idea, if not, in the sense that I was wondering how much of, strong personal autonomy-based conception was behind the idea of nudges, because there is a paternalistic dimension. And ostensibly, you seem to be focusing on choice. But on the other hand, when you give the example of the regressive thought or, COVID vaccines, for instance, I was wondering if the corollary would hold true in the sense that if someone was actually, reading what you might call true, objectively true information, would they still kind of be forcibly made to choose between true and false? And you said you just want to kind of, open up the competition between something, open up the competition by adding more choices to the game. But I was wondering if the competition might be lost in the end, even by what might be objective truth. So that was one thing. On law, I actually wanted to kind of push back on what you said, because the way I read the idea of nudge, there is a paternalistic dimension, and the moment paternalism comes in, you can't evade the question of rights. So liberty has already been kind of compromised to a certain extent the moment paternalism has been brought in. So I was wondering what you had to say and how you would relate your idea of let's keep law out of it in the context of nudge and even otherwise. Right, but thanks a lot. This is super interesting, of course. And yeah, actually turning to Nina very quickly. The global and local distinction, of course, you appeal to a different understanding of personal autonomy in a more relational sense. And the global and local distinction, of course, in the sense that I thought you understood global. Maybe one could understand global in two senses. One is this whole comprehensive relational dimension. The second is an innate capacity that is sort of presumed. And I was wondering, on both these accounts, so even if it is a more relational account, to what extent, how far should one go to kind of understand something to be part of one's global autonomy? So just because someone is not allowed to have a certain interaction, would that still be a violation? So basically, that's too broad understanding in terms of global, in terms of an innate capacity. I have my doubts whether legal systems can admit of a violation of global autonomy in that sense, in the sense that it's a precondition for being a legal participant at times. And if global autonomy has been compromised by certain interactions, how can the legal system actually have a recourse to basically someone who's been not basically kicked out of being a legal participant because of a lack of that capacity? For instance, of course, open debates, but infants, mentally disabled, the marginal questions of personhood. Right. Again, so now but again, extremely interesting, especially the collective dimension. I want to kind of come back to that in a minute. But before that, Christoph's presentation. So I thought what was behind Christoph's worry was, the empirical basis of claims, that social media interactions and manipulation could count as a violation of freedom of thought. And again, that has to do with the causation. How can you consider a certain technology used to have directly led to a certain harm? And of course, this is also open to discussion in the investigations against Meta and so on. It could be someone's vulnerability, coming to what Nina said, that contributed to resultant mental condition, for example. But I thought, and now coming back to pushing back against the non-legal claim, going really legal about this and walking into the legal forest, so to say. Now I understand that there is a problem of diffusion of uh, the basis of claiming that something was a resultant harm due to a certain technology. I understand that there's a certain diffusion of responsibility, the many hands problem, so to say. But it's not like the legal systems had not dealt with it before, in the sense that there are other contexts, and maybe one way to think about, especially because a point of agreement is positive obligation to the state, I thought maybe something along the lines of climate change litigation might be an interesting perspective to look at. Because it is a global problem of sort, and individually no one may be able to claim that there has been a harm resultant due to use of certain technology, but collectively that is a problem. And maybe that might be something to look at, because yeah, in some sense, the problem is global. And that leads to the problem of understanding the right to freedom of thought as an individual right. And should it be understood as a right that is basically about rescuing an autonomous agent, either by certain supplementations or just removing certain constraints, or perhaps we might draw inspiration from other legal fields. That's basically what I wanted to say. Quite inspired by the Klima Signorinen case of the Grand Chamber of the European Court. But thanks a lot and looking forward to the discussion.
Wow, Kelly, thank you. You did a tremendous job of picking out some of the really the juiciest points, ripe for bruising and prodding. And so let's open up for questions. You can raise your little yellow hand, your real hand, or you can put it in the chat box. Someone, Andre, already put a comment in. So Andre, if you want to start, you can, or I can read it out. Rebecca, can you go ahead? And then I will either read out Andre's. Okay, he can't speak. So you go ahead, Andre. So Rebecca, then I'll read out Andre's question in the chat, and then I'll go to Shlo's. Okay.
So thank you all for these very interesting presentations. I really enjoy listening to it. And I have a question for Christophe de Blitz. So I'm very curious, and I haven't yet read your paper, so maybe you discuss this in the paper. But I was curious, you say that we haven't yet proven that, for instance, social media has like a severe effect, for instance, a severe negative effect on mental autonomy, and that therefore we cannot yet conclude that it interferes with freedom of thought. And I was wondering, okay, how much proof do we need? Because we can already see that there are like some parallels between, for instance, social media and addictive gambling games, for instance. But it is also true that if we are talking about the neurological evidence, then what I see in the literature is that you need to do like very long-term studies. So I think it can take like 10 years before we know whether actually the brains of people who use smartphone apps, whether they're changing in the same way as people who do like a lot of gambling. So I was just curious, how much proof do we need before we can conclude whether there is like a severe effect?
Yes, should I answer right away? But yes, thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, so I need to clarify my point, also with respect to what Kelly was just saying. So I'm not necessarily saying that we haven't proven yet. So it's not about the proof of or the causation problem, even though I think we have not yet proven. I think that even if it doesn't mean that freedom of thought is interfered with or violated, because the right has a very high threshold. We don't really know where it is, and we can argue a little bit whether there should be a high threshold or how high it should be. But I think most of the social media kind of things at the moment will not meet this threshold. And there's a range of reasons, and this would probably feed into a framework that Nina would be developing. So one of them is at some point we are not stripped to the chair and exposed to this. We still have some, tomorrow we can delete our accounts. I know it's not that easy in practice, but we do this in a sense voluntarily, and we can argue what voluntarily means. And then every time we do this in a little bit voluntarily. So it's the way we use it. And then it's the minorish influence that I think perhaps in hardcore users, in vulnerable people which are not in sound mind, hardcore users that then have hardcore effects, we may say so. But I don't think this, at least for the standard adult user, I don't think this really gets the problem. Now, with digital technologies, because I think the problem applies to all of us, perhaps more or less in a degree. I think the problem is there. It's just a minor-ish problem, but it's very pervasive. So I think we need different tools to address it. The same, Kelly, response to what you said. Can we not just lower the standard? Can we not? Yeah, we can say, let's argue freedom of thought should be triggered by, let's say, sophisticated advertisement. At the moment, it's not, and there's nothing wrong in principle to say this, but this will completely change all kinds of social interactions that we have once we say so. And my claim would be, we need to be better in identifying the peculiar problems of digital technologies rather than throwing the general standards out of the window. I don't think this is necessary. I think we can get to the problems of digital technologies, freedom of thought. The lens of freedom of thought might just not be particularly helpful to identify these things. Okay, so for now, thank you.
Thanks, Christoph. Richard, I'm going to read out the question in the chat from Andre. In your perspective, do users have intellectual capacity to make conscious decisions on whether to join or not to join specific social networks? Is capacity to make such a decision related to freedom of thought?
That's an awesome question. Thank you for it. Yes, they have the capacity for freedom of thought, but whether they exercise, that's a different question. I think this kind of ties into what Christoph was just saying about what actually influences people to think and do certain things. And I think social effects are a big one. And I think if you particularly think about the network effects of social media and the capture of the market that certain platforms have, whether people are able to resist any sort of pull, whether that's from professional peers or just staying connected to family members or whatnot, because they're the ones all on a specific platform, it can be tricky. So I don't think that's so much of a, whatever you want to frame it as, freedom of thought issue, sort of mental autonomy, but more about the social factors that draw people towards particular platforms. But I think there is an interesting sort of intertwining there about, like I said earlier, about what people think and the social influences that make them think certain things. If just quickly, just to speak to Kelly's point about nudges and paternalism, I don't think nudges are paternalistic or libertarian. I think that whole point within the literature about nudges are a great what do they call it, quote unquote, libertarian paternalism is not a very convincing ethic. I don't think nudges are paternalistic at all. And more often than not, I think they're remarkably problematic. I think you have to design them very carefully so that they do not interfere with autonomy, because the way I see it, and this sort of goes to Bethany's point about where's the line between, or sort of what's the difference between manipulation and persuasion. I think quite a lot of that lies in awareness, in that if you're aware, because when you're being persuaded of something, if you're aware of that, then I don't think it's interfering with your autonomy. But if you're not aware that you're being influenced, then I think that's problematic. And I think that's in particular where nudges can be really harmful. I'll just leave that there. Oh, yeah, I had a note on the climate change point, which I actually really like, because a lot of these cases are litigated based on consumer protection and tort law. And I was actually thinking about this more. If you want to think about this as a global problem, I'd be really curious if anybody's working on anything to do with the common law of nuisance. Because if I thought about that, this was a few years ago in a separate workshop where people brought up social media and climate change in the same topic. And both those are global issues. And I was thinking about this from the idea of like they both cause a lot of nuisance if you think about it, or they at least contribute to it. And so I wanted to just say that's quite a cool little link you drew there. I'll leave that just now. I've got plenty more to say, but I'll shut up.
Thanks, Richard. Jos, do you have your hand up? Do you want to say something?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, thanks. So thanks everyone for the nice presentations. So I was wondering, when Christoph said, okay, so the ethicists, maybe they should just talk about cognitive liberty, not to blur the debate when we talk about freedom of thought, just to know what we are talking about. I think it's a good point, and it made me wonder. So would it maybe also make sense for the legal debates, at least as far as the positive obligations are concerned, to also use a more broad term? For example, okay, what are we concerned about? We are concerned about how digital technologies impact on our mental autonomy, for example, as Nina mentioned. And so when we think about negative obligations following from human rights, it matters a lot whether we are talking about freedom of thought and whether something falls within the scope of freedom of thought, because then you engage absolute protection. But when you just fall within the scope of the right to mental integrity, for example, a different protection applies. But maybe this is less relevant when we talk about positive obligations. And I can imagine that. So the positive obligation to enable, to ensure the conditions of an enabling environment for freedom of thought, for example, that the conditions for such an enabling environment may well overlap with, for example, an enabling environment for autonomy or for the freedom of opinion or for the right to mental integrity. So my question is just to the group: would it make sense, perhaps, if you are looking from a legal point of view to a set of positive obligations to protect our mental autonomy in this area, not to look at this through the lens of one or two specific human rights, but more look through the lens of protecting the personal interest of mental autonomy, for which positive obligations from all these different rights are relevant? Hope this makes sense. Thank you.
Do any of our speakers want to respond?
I would if nobody else wants, but Richard and Nina, you go first, please.
I was just going to make a few points, and I mean this is quite a challenging question, but I think I agree that there's definitely a lot of overlap in positive obligations between different rights protecting mental autonomy, and I think that's particularly the case when we think about enabling environment obligations. So it feels like a bit of a cheap answer, but I want to say that we should do both. I mean, look at the specific positive obligations for freedom of thought, for example, in relation to preventing maybe online manipulation, or in another field in relation to neurotechnologies or things like that. But at the same time, when it comes to enabling environment, maybe have a broader approach that's kind of cuts across different rights. I don't know if that's a very satisfying answer to yours, but I also wanted to actually mention one of your papers, yours. I think you wrote about, you were a bit critical of the idea of manipulation, and you kind of raised this very interesting idea of using the concept of exploitation. I found that really interesting because one thing that came to mind when Kelly mentioned, that we all said that there were a lot of problems with social media. I think it's important to emphasize, maybe it sounds a bit silly, but that of course it's not all problems, but to me the heart of the issue is really looking at power structures, and the power structures that lie behind the platforms and lie behind people kind of using and abusing the platforms. And I think exploitation is a really interesting kind of concept to bring in here and to look at together with autonomy when we think about how influence and power is being exercised. And I think that also takes me to a point that Christoph made, saying, well, it doesn't look like, it's not obvious that social media and social media related issues violate freedom of thought. I think that, to me, it seems like that kind of rests on a couple of premises that I think could be have been challenged by several people here and others, which is first, I think that the lack of kind of historical protection, freedom of thought against these types of influences doesn't necessarily mean that they don't warrant protection under the right to freedom of thought. And I think an analogy that I find quite strong is slavery, and particularly the case law of the European Court of Human Rights under Article 4, and how it took quite some time before the right was actually applied in a modern context, and before the court developed this now quite substantial case law about modern slavery and trafficking as slavery, when this had primarily been envisaged in quite a different way originally. And I think this is a very clear example of that in relation to freedom of thought. This right that was maybe envisioned in a more restrictive way because the circumstances were very different, and also I think crucially, I think the understanding of the mind was very different. I think now warrant a different interpretation, both because of the circumstances, but also because I think there's also a greater understanding of the interrelation of different mental processes, and the fact that when you manipulate somebody with the aim of changing their political opinion, well, there's also emotions are also manipulated. There's all these different interrelated thought processes that are involved. So I think all of these kind of contemporary understandings are, should shape the right to freedom of thought. And I think there was a last point that I wanted to make. Oh, two more points, sorry. Just on to pick up on Kelly's point about the collective dimension. I think I find the kind of recent case law on surveillance, on mass surveillance, very interesting to think about, because of this idea, firstly, that you don't necessarily have to show, when it's kind of this type of harm where it's really difficult to show that you have in fact been targeted or subject to mass surveillance, or that you have suffered harm from it, but to accept that actually the fact that there's a credible claim that you could have been subjected to this surveillance and that you were within a group, that's sufficient to bring a claim of a violation. I think that could be very interesting to explore in a freedom of thought context. And the last thing I wanted to say is in relation to Richard's presentation. I think, at some point you also mentioned this or acknowledged this, but I was a bit, I wanted to ask about this idea of kind of regressive thought and kind of straying from the truth. And is there a danger with that to almost do the opposite of freedom of thought, and the idea that the state should not sit and pass judgment on what people think, or try to infer what people think? If we start looking at are people thinking false thoughts, then does that run a danger of actually interfering in that way? And secondly, also my question is who gets to determine what is true and what is false, and is there a risk that it will be just, again, those in power, those who hold the most power, who will kind of shape the narrative? Thank you.
Thanks, Nina. Christoph has his hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, so Yeah, perhaps it's Nina first. So I wouldn't necessarily object to a development for freedom of thought as with freedom from slavery. It's possible. I wouldn't want to stand in the way of that. I just think, given the fact that I think we are still waiting for any application of freedom of thought, really in a substantive sense, in any international court, it's probably very unlikely that we will then see also a dramatic expansion of this because also, I mean, we have this manipulation all the time. I don't know, let's get into the anecdotes the last 5 minutes. So when I tried to buy a new couch the other day in this furniture store, what all they try to do with, hey, the price will rise, and are you really committed to buying, and I can give you a good price. So we have all these kind of manipulative influences, and we will have a hard time drawing differences there. Ethics has a hard time. I don't think we can all subsume them under freedom of thought, but I wouldn't mind if in the future we would do so. And show us, I think it's a good idea, but if my problem a little bit with much of this human rights sphere documents is that there is already quite a lot of conceptual flexibility. And then they write about a topic, and then they start with the right, and then it goes into all kinds of other topics. So if they would, like the UN institutions and the rapporteurs and so forth, I would sometimes hope for more conceptual clarity rather than introducing new concepts such as mental autonomy, very large concept. Now that then they will all write about this. To me, it's much better if we stick to the right and if we show, look, this falls under this right, and if it's overlapping, that isn't a problem. I think human rights are, interwoven and interrelated, and what they are always saying, mutually reinforcing. I think overlapping is not so much a problem, but this conceptual diffusion into anything that becomes a human right is, I think, for me, more of a problem. But nonetheless, good, interesting idea.
Thanks. Any more questions or comments from the floor? Any thoughts? Any comments? No pressure. Someone.
No, I was going to say, if you want me to respond really quickly to Nina and a few. So the point about you made, the dangers with respect to regressive thoughts and then states sort of taking an impetus and initiative to try and engage and deal with false content. I think the big issue there is not so much determining what is true, because that is very, very difficult, but more about sort of debunking or at least getting people to question things that are just objectively false and consider things that are, let's just say, more closely aligned with what might be true than as opposed to being closely indoctrinated with something that's just categorically false. Like, for example, you get vaccinated and that means you're going to have a chip from Bill Gates the rest of your life. I think that's more of a problem. Just debunking that sort of stuff. And really quickly on the point about this, I liked Shore's article as well on enslaving minds, and I do think this idea of conceptualizing things of thought is more something that involves exploitation as opposed to manipulation. If you're looking at it from a legal perspective, especially if you're thinking about litigation, might be more helpful because there's more to draw on in terms of, let's say, doctrinal law. Unless I'm really missing something, I just want to have my 2 pennies on that, and I'll leave that
there. Thanks, Richard. I mean, I can see Nina's got her hand up, but I just had one question in relation to the kind of details you just gave about, well, conspiracy theories, and how you would balance the apparent harm, and it's not clear on whether an intervention against these views would be preventative or reactive, but how you balance that then with freedom of expression, particularly in the form of dissent, political dissent, counterculture. To use a really crude example, QAnon thought that there was a secret cartel of elite people who had a paedophile ring. And then the Epstein file shows us that by and large, you can describe it in those ways. That was a conspiracy theory up until very recently. So I just wonder how you're going to balance these things.
Well, so how I'm not sure. The one thing I do think is to not go too far the other way and prevent that sort of, to use your term, dissent, because I'm always trying to hammer this home. Just because you supply false information does not mean people are going to consume it. Even if they consume it, does not mean they're going to believe it. Even if they believe it, does not mean any behavior is going to stem from that. And even if it doesn't mean that behavior is going to be harmful in any way. And then there's the added extension, even if it is harmful, doesn't mean it's a legal violation. So I'm much more towards the view of like there should be interventions on social media, but I don't think things that are more on the extreme end, like takedowns, for example, I think they're remarkably problematic, not from just a freedom of thought standpoint, but expression, because you've got the backfiring effect of these things as well. Like the Streisand effect's a perfect example. Take something offline, people are going to have more interest in it. So I think it's more about interventions that allow users to have some more say about what they actually consume online. And it goes back to Nina's point as well about transparency, about being clear about what you're exactly interacting with. And this is why I think something it's a technical intervention, but I think it holds some promise. AI watermarking, being completely clear that, oh, I'm engaging with a piece of content that was made by a computer as opposed to a human. I think that matters. But I'll leave that there. But I think that there are clear risks, obviously, Golden State stepping in too far and taking things down offline that they shouldn't be. It should just be left to sit.
Nina, did you want to have the final word before we wrap up?
Oh, that's a lot of pressure. No, I was just gonna say, just gonna say two final things in relation to what Christoph and Richard said. I just briefly, I think, Christoph, you mentioned this idea of like manipulation and, things that are more minor. And I think really the thing that seems really important to me is having a cumulative approach to, it's a systemic issue, and it's not necessarily, we're not talking necessarily about one attempt to manipulate. We're talking about kind of targeted over an extended period of time, multiple influences. So I think that's really key, that kind of cumulative approach. And to Richard, I think I found the I think that the point that Beth raised is very interesting about the conspiracy theories. And there's a chapter by Emine Yıldırım in a book that I think some of you have written in The Law and Ethics of Freedom of Thought. And she gives this example of conspiracy theory. And she gives two examples. In one, it's just, a social media platform where someone kind of publishes a conspiracy theory, and it kind of ends there. People see it and, nothing more. And in the second case, it's kind of like a targeted influence strategy. It gets amplified and all these things. And she argues quite persuasively that, the first case wouldn't be a violation of freedom of thought and the second would. And I think that's quite interesting in, the idea that maybe also receiving false information is a part of, how we shape our thinking. We believe things that are false, and then we learn that they're not true, and maybe it's more about the kind of strategies to deceive people and influence people that we should focus on. Those were my last thoughts.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you everyone so much for coming today. Thank you everyone who contributed to discussion in the chat and through the video. Please remember that the Freedom of Thought mailing list network mailing list has transferred to a different host. and that you can circulate anything to everyone on the mailing list if you wish. We really welcome ideas for presentations. That can be your own research, it can be someone else's, it can be ideas for panel discussions like this one. We really want to keep this as active as possible and to have lots of different people contributing. So all ideas are very welcome, but for now, thank you to all of our speakers and thank you to our discussant Kelly, and have a fabulous evening wherever you are. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Kelly. Thanks. Bye. Thanks, Bernard.